All right, welcome back everyone. I'm going to walk us through a demo involving the dry media techniques. This first one is just based on suggested homework assignment for Tuesday. Starting off with a simple spherical shape, a conical shape, and sort of deciding on where to put my box here. So I think I'll do a kind of a cube, just sketching this freehand. Remember, if you want your lines to be a bit smoother, straighter, then turn on smoothing. Take advantage of those tools to make it look easy. Okay, I'll take this back down to normal. And I now have 3 forms, and let me start off by deciding on where I want my light source and all that stuff to be. Now I'm working with white right now and using one of the pencils from my library to define a background. Leaving that a little soft around the edge, a little bit rough, and with more and more passes with the brush at this scale. I guess I can call it the pencil, because that's what we're trying to simulate here. With the pencil tip at its current scale, I can get done before. Now, one thing I want you to notice, if you are working with any of the brushes that simulate dry media, and what I want you to notice is that the grain or the texture associated with that tip will unfortunately scale up and down with the brush. So here's an example. So this one dot, or this one little quick stroke, there's a scale associated with the brush tip itself. And the scale of the brush is also going to give you either more or less texture. So there's just the dot from the brush tip itself, and then here's what happens when we apply pressure and stroke. So we're getting the accumulation of many instances of this picture overlapping and creating the illusion of an underlying texture. Now take a look at what happens when I just scale the brush down. Okay, so that first stroke, you can see, get a little closer here so we can compare the two. Okay. Now, as far as I can tell, the scale of that texture a little hard to tell if it's scaling up and down with the tip. So one way that I can check that is by going into the brushes, the brush settings. Now look at the texture, and then you can see that it says texture each tip. So let's compare the texture each tip result. So big brush, getting that result. Smaller brush, and you see that the gaps in there are comparable to what we got with the larger stroke. Okay. So that's actually something we want to consider. I'm going to turn this feature off. And now I have full density when I have the brush small. And then when I go larger, things are also going to accumulate gradually and eventually fill in. So back to the other settings so that we can compare. Stroking over a few passes and several passes, and eventually it gets to a point where the simulated grain of the paper is still present, but we're at the maximum. this is about as deep or as filled in as those little pits in our imaginary paper could be. Same thing at this scale. It's going to stroke, it's going to build up and build up, but eventually you're going to reach a point where, well, this one will eventually fill in, but you're going to still have some gaps around. Okay. So there will likely be, in whichever application you're using, a similar set of settings where the texture that's being applied to the brush tip can be set to remain apparent, throughout, as almost as if you have a texture behind or underneath your canvas everywhere you paint. Or you can, and that texture is just going to not go anywhere as you scale the brush up and down. Or you can have it to where the texture is just localized as part of the brush. Here's a larger area. Okay. So fortunately, this particular texture, if I hover over here, I might be able to see, this is the fine grain, 256 pixels by 256 pixels. So this is a texture that is, there's a lot of information in there. If I scale it up to maybe double its actual size and then with it, it's possible that we might see more of that texture expressed within the stroke. Eventually, depending on how the texture was designed and how much area you cover and how large your strokes are, you might be able to spot the texture itself. Also notice that there are some other added features built into this brush as we go. But just so you know, the scale, the brightness, the contrast of the texture, there are lots of settings that I can use to influence what the result is over here on my canvas. Like here, the depth is set to 100. I can have some of these, the depth itself can vary. I think that's what some of that sort of sparkling around the edges is all about, just some variation there. And that can even be tied to how much pressure I apply. And have that texture vary randomly. Go ahead and close that there. Taking a quick sweep with my lasso tool. And you see, I'm going to use a Command Z to get back to an earlier state. Out of Command Z's, and take my brush, sample that background, and then we'll kind of back to square one. Alright, so I'm going to sample this kind of like my charcoal white, and let's assume that I'm going to have a little bit of a dusting of a highlight over on the right sides of my objects. So fairly large, broad strokes, trying to cover as much distance as possible. But also recognizing that this first application of color is going to be a bit rough. Here I'm going to apply this kind of a gradation. And now I can really see, because I went really big, I can really see that texture from the brush tip scaling up. So another way to think about this particular brush, the brush tip has texture designed into the tip. There is also a texture, a grain, that being mixed with the brush as I paint. So we're getting a little bit of both, a double whammy with the effects here. So the main goal here is just to be aware of how the texture, whether it's attached to the brush tip or if it is part of some data that's being applied to the brush as you paint, just be aware of how that system is working, so that you understand how a simple action like scaling up or scaling down your brush tip might affect your results. The more we can predict and anticipate when we're painting digitally, I think the more successful the work will be. Okay, I'm going to drop my opacity down just a bit and my flow, because now while I'm zoomed out here, This is very similar to the blocking in phase I've been sharing with you. What I want to do is just make sure that I don't get too chalky, too much texture. Every once in a while I have these moments where I'm looking, watching, and I'm wondering, am I actually painting or not? So, looks like I am. I'm going to cover this area. And then my second color, if you look at my color picker over here on the right hand side, and within this triangle, I am now going to use the brightness slider, and I can watch and see what the dot does there. So I'm keeping the same hue, which is kind of a reddish color. I'm going to darken this to a deeper value, and then I'll just use a few shortcuts here to maybe establish a shadow side. I'm keeping the brush at a smaller scale, and keeping in mind the fact that if I do a few kind of stabbing strokes, you're going to see more of the texture pretty much from the brush tip itself, the instances of that brush tip. And let's see, as that edge turns, I'm guessing that I'm going to get a dark edge there, sampling the intermediate color, painting back over, pushing that back. And if you have an understanding of how shadows work, then you might go ahead and extend. Just kind of have a little suggestion of some shadows happening here. And subtract out of that shape. Go to my brush. And so that time I went right to the color picker triangle to choose my color, and I'm just doing a big broad stroke there. The smaller I go, the less, or the more strokes I apply, the less of that texture I'm going to see in those shadows. Let's see, I'm going to do one more. Here is my elliptical marquee tool. I just hit letter M and then Shift M to switch to that one. Using the space bar while I keep the pen depressed, and I can move this while I still have the pen tip down. That looks like a good location for that next cast shadow. I'm going to subtract out with my lasso tool. L, Option. I'm going to subtract out this portion. And then I'm going to take another ellipse, L, try again. And I'm going to hold Option down and start drawing an ellipse with Option still held down, adding the space bar so that I can reposition that ellipse. This ellipse is going to take a bite out of the one that I just drew. So releasing the pen tip, and there we go. So I have a little cast shadow there. Right, and then maybe one more little selection. Tap, tap, tap. Brush. Maybe I'm just going to go ahead and do a light dusting of this. This is kind of like a brown charcoal or sanguine Conti going on. So it's through the repeated strokes that I'm getting and playing with the scale of the brush tip that I'm getting this kind of sense of this being a drawing done in traditional media. Okay, back to my ellipse tool. M. Then hold the Shift key down this time. Deselect everything, Command D. I'm going to leave it a little wonky. So I think what I want to do is just freehand. Stroking. And even my choice of direction for my strokes can help with describing the form, I think, more clearly. These strokes are going, it's almost like running my finger across the roundness of the ball, whereas these strokes are like running my finger along the side, up and down. Similarly, these parallel strokes are going to give the impression of sliding up and down along an angle against that edge. If I sample the background color, I can create the illusion of erasing while still including some of that texture from the brush tip itself. So I'm developing some reflected light, a stronger form shadow there. I'm going to push in a little more of the paper color. And I might even soften these edges as they get further away from the object itself. It's kind of this phenomena when you study the physics of light and cast shadows. There's theories in terms of what shapes should look like when you cast a shadow, but then there are also these things that you can observe. And that can be really fascinating. Why do sometimes you get some interesting spreading happening on the shadows, or some softening along the edges? There was a recent announcement, I think it was real. A group of students, I think they were grad students, maybe physics students, figured out how to levitate a small object using light. So I don't know what that's going to lead to. It reminds me of when I first saw superconductivity was discovered back when I was probably during my high school years, and we thought we were going to have all this levitating vehicles, and it's going to be this miraculous new technology. It's going to affect everything, but it just kind of disappeared. Or maybe it's in use in some secret lab somewhere. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video here, and then whenever we return, I will have more of this refined, and this will end the demo for simulating dry media.